Keanu Reeves, known worldwide for his roles in blockbuster films like The Matrix and John Wick, had always been someone who seemed to live by his own rules. He wasn't your typical Hollywood star, always keeping things low-key and out of the spotlight. His charm, kindness, and humility had earned him a massive fan base, but beyond the public persona, he was an enigma. Fans loved him for his sincerity and his ability to remain grounded, despite his immense fame. He didn't seek attention, and whenever he was interviewed, he stayed true to his character, calm, kind, and always respectful. That night, he was scheduled to appear on one of the most watched late-night talk shows. It was a big deal. The show's host was well known for being a bit provocative and not afraid to ask tough questions. The studio was buzzing with energy, as Keanu had become somewhat of a legend in Hollywood, a man whose privacy was almost as iconic as his roles. The audience was eager to see if he would reveal anything about his personal life, as they were always curious about the real Keanu behind the screen. Keanu entered the stage to the familiar sounds of applause. He waved, offering his signature modest smile as he made his way to the seat beside the host. The moment he sat down, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't just the normal talk show energy anymore. There was something more electric in the air. Everyone in the audience and those watching at home felt the anticipation. The host, who had a reputation for being sharp-tongued, greeted Keanu with his usual enthusiasm. "Keanu, thank you so much for being here tonight. We've all been waiting for this," he said, his voice carrying a mix of excitement and a hint of sarcasm. Keanu nodded, looking genuinely appreciative, but he didn't say much at first. He was more of a listener, letting the conversation come to him. The host, sensing Keanu's quiet demeanor, decided to kick things off with a light-hearted question about his recent film projects. Keanu spoke about his latest movie, detailing some of the action sequences and sharing a few behind-the-scenes moments. He even joked about how exhausted he had been from all the intense fight choreography. The audience laughed, finding his stories both entertaining and relatable. But then, as the conversation naturally progressed, the host, known for taking risks, turned the topic towards something a little more personal. He leaned in slightly, his eyes glinting with the promise of a more challenging question. "Keanu, you've always been known as someone who keeps a very private life. You rarely talk about your personal affairs, and yet you've built this incredible, almost mysterious persona. Why is that? Is it by choice? Or is there something you're hiding from us?" The question caught Keanu off guard, and the shift in tone didn't go unnoticed by the audience. There was a slight pause as Keanu absorbed the words. It wasn't that the question was untrue. Keanu had always been protective of his personal life, but it was still an invasion of privacy. The quiet humility he was known for made him hesitant to respond too sharply, but his face showed signs of discomfort. Keanu adjusted in his seat, trying to redirect the conversation. He smiled politely, his voice calm but firm. "Well, I believe there's a lot to be said for keeping some things private," he said. "I'm here to talk about the work. My personal life is my own." The host raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by Keanu's response. He wasn't ready to let the conversation die just yet. "But you know, Keanu, people are fascinated by you. They want to know more. You're always so composed, so low-key, and it makes people curious. You must have your reasons, right? I mean, you've been in the spotlight for decades now, and yet we hardly know anything about you. Some might say it's all part of the mystique, don't you think?" Keanu's calm smile remained, but his eyes hardened slightly. It was clear that he wasn't fond of talking about this. The tension in the room became palpable as the host pressed further. "I mean, I get it. You're a great actor and you've got this whole mysterious thing going on, but people are starting to wonder. Is it all just an act? Are you keeping secrets from us? From your fans?" The room went silent. Even the host seemed to realize that he had just stepped over a line. There was a brief moment where everything seemed to pause. Keanu, though always composed, now had a slight tension in his posture. He was trying to remain calm, trying not to let his discomfort show, but it was clear that the host's questions were beginning to cross a line. The audience, sensing the shift, looked between Keanu and the host. Some were unsure whether they should laugh at the host's boldness, while others were beginning to feel the weight of the awkwardness hanging in the air. This wasn't the usual fun banter that talk shows were known for. There was something more personal happening here, something that made the audience feel like they were intruding on a private moment. Keanu took a deep breath, the silence stretching a little longer than it should have. His response when it came was slow and deliberate. "I think everyone has the right to their privacy," he began, his voice steady. "I've always felt that way. What I share with the public, I share. What I keep to myself, I keep to myself. That's my choice, and I'd appreciate it if people respected that." The host's grin faltered for just a second. He had clearly pushed Keanu to the edge, but the actor's response was measured and respectful, though there was an underlying firmness to it that made it clear he wouldn't tolerate any further invasion into his personal space. "Look, I get it," the host said, quickly trying to recover from the tension in the room. "I respect your privacy, Keanu. I just think it's fascinating how you've built this persona. You've been around for so long and yet you're still this mystery to people. That's something really rare in Hollywood." Keanu nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "I suppose that's true," he said, his tone still calm but no longer defensive. "But I'm not in this business to create a persona. I'm here because I love acting. I love telling stories. Everything else, well, that's not really what matters to me." The host, now realizing that the conversation was starting to veer in a direction he hadn't anticipated, cleared his throat and attempted to change the subject. All right, no more personal questions. Let's talk about your new movie then." But the damage had already been done. The shift in the tone of the conversation was evident. The audience's enthusiasm had waned slightly, and Keanu, though polite as ever, now had an air of quiet discomfort about him. The host had pushed too far, and Keanu's response made it clear that some lines were not meant to be crossed. As the segment continued, the mood in the studio remained somewhat tense. The host tried to salvage the situation by asking about Keanu's love for motorcycles and how he still enjoyed riding despite his busy schedule. But it was clear that the earlier tension had left a mark. Keanu's usual ease had been replaced by a more guarded version of himself, and the audience could feel it. The interview had taken a strange turn, and the energy in the room felt different. It wasn't the usual buzz of excitement and laughter you'd expect during a late-night talk show. Now there was an uncomfortable quiet hanging in the air. Keanu had been asked about his personal life, and the host had pushed him to a point where Keanu's patience seemed to be running thin. Keanu had always been a man of few words. He wasn't the type to over-explain himself, nor was he quick to share details about his life outside of work. He had always kept his private world hidden from the spotlight. It wasn't that he had anything to hide. It was more that he believed some things were just meant to be kept to yourself. In an industry where everyone's business seemed to be everyone else's, Keanu's preference for privacy was something that made him stand out even more. He was a man who didn't need to tell the world everything about him to be respected. But that night, the host had dug a little deeper than usual. The questions had been probing, personal, and perhaps a bit too much. Keanu's natural instinct was to brush it off, as he usually did, but the host's persistence had made the situation uncomfortable. What had started as an innocent conversation about his latest movie had suddenly veered into areas Keanu didn't want to go. The host, feeling the shift in the mood, realized that he had pushed too far. The tension in the room was thick, and even the live audience could sense it. The usual upbeat energy had dulled, and everyone was now waiting to see how Keanu would respond. The host, always the one in control of the conversation, suddenly felt like he was losing grip. Keanu sat back in his chair, looking more composed than ever. His calmness, though, wasn't helping to ease the discomfort. He had answered the questions as politely as possible, but he had made it clear that there was a limit to how much he would share. And the host, though he had a reputation for being fearless, couldn't ignore the fact that he had crossed a line. The audience, sensing the awkwardness, shifted in their seats. Some of them looked down, unsure if they had just witnessed a private moment or if this was just another act in the world of celebrity interviews. A few whispered among themselves while others stared at the host, waiting for him to somehow make this right. But the tension didn't dissipate immediately. It hung in the air like a cloud, thick and unshakable. The host, trying to salvage the interview, quickly moved on to another topic, hoping to steer the conversation back to safer ground. All right, he said, trying to sound casual, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Let's talk about something else. How's the motorcycle collection going? I know you've always been passionate about bikes. Keanu, ever the professional, nodded and gave a small smile. He was grateful for the change in subject, but the moment still lingered. He spoke with enthusiasm about his love for motorcycles, sharing stories about the different bikes he owned and how he enjoyed riding whenever he had the chance. For a brief moment, the tension seemed to ease as Keanu's natural warmth returned, but it was clear that the dynamic had shifted. The balance of the conversation had been disrupted, and no amount of small talk could completely erase the uncomfortable energy that had settled in. The host, eager to regain control, continued asking questions about Keanu's career, his upcoming projects, and his passion for filmmaking. Keanu, though polite, answered briefly. He didn't dive into any long-winded explanations. It was as if he was holding back, keeping a part of himself closed off, perhaps more than usual. The host could sense it. The actor was always private, but now, there was a clear barrier between them. As the interview went on, the host began to shift uneasily in his chair. He had made a mistake, and now he didn't know how to recover from it. There was a slight nervousness in his voice as he asked Keanu about his charitable work, something that had always been a part of the actor's life. Keanu had been known for his generosity, often donating large sums of money to causes close to his heart, without ever making a big deal out of it. The host, perhaps trying to get back on track, pressed for more details about his charitable efforts. But once again, Keanu's response was calm, almost distant. "I try to do what I can," he said simply, "but that's not something I talk about much. It's just something I feel is important." His words were brief, and his tone made it clear that this too was off limits for discussion. The audience, sensing that Keanu wasn't going to open up further, began to shift in their seats. Some felt the awkwardness too, while others respected Keanu's decision to keep certain parts of his life private. The host, trying to keep the conversation going, tossed out another question about Keanu's philosophy on life, hoping to find a topic that might relax the actor. But it was clear now that the conversation was no longer flowing smoothly. Keanu, though still polite, was now speaking in a way that made it impossible for the host to push him further. It was as though Keanu had drawn a line, and the host had crossed it. The respect that had been there in the beginning of the interview had slowly been replaced by an uncomfortable silence that neither side knew how to break. The host, now visibly flustered, started to ask about Keanu's relationships, but as soon as the question left his lips, he realized it wasn't the right choice. The room seemed to hold its breath. Keanu, who had already been so calm in the face of earlier questions, didn't flinch this time. He simply turned his head slightly, his gaze sharp but not angry. "That's not something I discuss," Keanu said, his voice firm. "My personal life is mine, and I don't feel the need to share that with anyone." For a moment, the host looked caught off guard. He had pushed too far, and now even he seemed to realize it. The audience too seemed to react, some nodding in agreement with Keanu's words. The host quickly apologized, stumbling over his words as he tried to recover. "Sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, Keanu. I just thought it was an interesting topic." "I respect your privacy," he said, trying to sound genuine. Keanu gave a small nod, his face softening slightly, but his eyes remained guarded. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I just don't think some things need to be shared." The host, now regretting his approach, quickly shifted to a final question about Keanu's future projects, hoping to wrap things up on a positive note. Keanu answered briefly, speaking about an upcoming film, but it was clear that the magic of the conversation had disappeared. The host, now aware of his misstep, tried to finish the interview with a lighter note, thanking Keanu for coming on the show. Keanu smiled, his usual easygoing charm returning, but the underlying tension from the earlier moments was still there. As the interview concluded, Keanu stood up, shaking the host's hand firmly but without much enthusiasm. The applause that followed was polite, but it lacked the warmth and excitement that had greeted him at the beginning of the interview. The host, though trying to remain upbeat, couldn't hide the slight discomfort on his face. He had miscalculated, and now it was too late to undo what had been said. The audience slowly filed out of the studio, many of them talking in hushed voices, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Some were disappointed, others respected Keanu's decision to keep certain things private. But one thing was clear. The interview had not gone the way anyone had expected. The mood in the studio was tense, heavier than anyone expected. The awkwardness of the interview was undeniable, and it wasn't just felt by the host or the audience. It was evident in Keanu's calm but slightly guarded demeanor. As the camera cut to a commercial break, the audience shifted in their seats, unsure of what to make of the moment. The interview had been a roller coaster, and now everyone was left trying to process what had just unfolded. Keanu didn't look flustered, not in the way most people would have after such a confrontation. He had faced countless interviews over the years, and he had learned how to navigate uncomfortable situations with grace. But this time, something about the personal nature of the questions, the pressure to reveal parts of his life he held dear, had struck a chord with him. It wasn't that Keanu was averse to talking about himself. He had opened up about his childhood, his career, and even the occasional glimpse into his passions. But when it came to his private life, he had always drawn a firm line. It wasn't about keeping secrets, it was about protecting what mattered most to him, keeping the parts of his life that weren't for public consumption private. As the camera flashed back to the live broadcast, the host cleared his throat and looked at Keanu, trying to reset the mood. The energy in the room had shifted. The playful atmosphere that had existed earlier was now replaced with an undeniable tension. He could feel it. The audience could feel it. It was a rare moment in late-night television when the show's usual rhythm had been thrown off course. The host attempted to regain some of his usual charm, though it wasn't as effortless as before. "Keanu," he began, his voice softer than usual. "Thanks again for sticking with us tonight. I know that was a bit uncomfortable, but hey, you've always been a guy who doesn't shy away from tough conversations, right?" Keanu's expression softened slightly, though it was clear that he wasn't fully at ease. "I'm just here to talk about the work," he replied. His voice, still calm and composed, carried a quiet strength, one that reflected his boundaries without needing to say more. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He just wasn't going to let the host push him further. The host, perhaps realizing that he had overstepped, seemed to back off a bit. "I get it," he said a little more sheepishly. "Sometimes I can get carried away. I just thought it'd be interesting to talk about the man behind the roles, you know? But you're right. Some things are better left unsaid." Keanu nodded, offering a polite smile, but it was clear that he wasn't interested in rehashing the past moments. He was ready to move on. He had given enough. Now it was time to redirect the conversation back to safer ground. The host, sensing the need to recover the interview, quickly pivoted to a lighter topic. "So, Keanu," he continued, "I hear you're quite the traveler, always going from place to place for your films, but also for your personal adventures. You must have some great stories from your trips, right?" Keanu's posture relaxed slightly, and his eyes brightened as the new subject was brought up. Travel was something he loved to talk about. He enjoyed the freedom of it, the sense of discovery, the experiences he had in different parts of the world. It was something personal, but it wasn't a subject that felt invasive. He could talk about travel without feeling like he was being asked to reveal too much. "Well," Keanu began, leaning forward slightly, "I do love to travel. It's one of the best parts of my job. I get to see so many different places, meet people from all walks of life. I think it's one of the most rewarding parts of acting." The host, sensing that Keanu was more open to this line of questioning, pressed further. "Any trips that stand out in your memory? Something that really made an impact on you?" Keanu thought for a moment. There were many places he had visited over the years, but one trip stood out more than the others. It was a quiet trip, one that didn't make headlines or draw attention. It was a trip where he had been able to unplug, to be just himself without the noise of the world around him. "There was one trip I took to a small town in Japan a few years ago," Keanu said slowly, his voice taking on a more reflective tone. "I wasn't filming. I just wanted to get away from everything. The people there were so kind, so welcoming. I spent a lot of time just walking around, getting lost in the streets. It wasn't about the tourist spots or the famous landmarks. It was just about being present in a new place." The host nodded, clearly interested in Keanu's story. "Sounds like an incredible experience. Sometimes the best memories are made when you don't have a schedule to follow, right?" Keanu smiled, his eyes distant for a moment, as if he was remembering the peace he had found in that quiet town. "Exactly," he replied. "It's in those moments when you're not trying to chase anything, when you can just exist in the moment. That's when the real magic happens." The host, still picking up on Keanu's more relaxed tone, asked, "Have you ever thought about writing a book about your travels?" You've seen so much of the world. I think people would love to hear your stories." Keanu chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't think I'd be very good at it," he said with a modest smile. "I enjoy experiencing things, but I'm not one to write about them. Maybe I'll leave that to others." There was a warmth in Keanu's voice now, a lightness that had been missing just moments ago. It was clear that this was the kind of conversation he enjoyed. It was genuine. It was about sharing moments of life, not about opening up his private world to public scrutiny. The host, sensing that the conversation was returning to a more comfortable rhythm, continued to ask Keanu about his adventures, his work, and the films that had shaped his career. Keanu spoke freely, his words flowing more easily now. The earlier tension was slowly fading away, replaced by the familiar cadence of a relaxed interview. But even as Keanu shared stories and anecdotes, the host couldn't shake the feeling that the earlier moment still loomed large. There was a respect that had been established between them, a kind of unspoken understanding that Keanu wasn't willing to let go of his boundaries, no matter how much the host pressed. And in that moment, the host realized something important. He had learned something valuable from Keanu, something that didn't come from a script or a rehearsed answer. He had learned that some things were meant to be respected, some things were private, and that perhaps was one of the most important lessons to take away from the night. As the interview continued, the atmosphere lightened. The audience began to relax again, chuckling at Keanu's dry humor and enjoying his insights into the world of filmmaking. There was a sense that, despite the earlier tension, Keanu had handled the situation with grace and dignity. The host, now more careful with his questions, let Keanu guide the conversation, knowing that the actor had set the tone for the rest of the interview. In the end, the conversation wasn't about the personal revelations the host had been hoping for. It wasn't about uncovering the hidden truths of Keanu's private life. It was about respecting the man in front of the camera, the actor who had built a career on his talent, his humility, and his ability to connect with audiences on a deeper level. Keanu had shown that while he might be an open book when it came to his work, the pages of his private life were not for anyone else to turn. The night had stretched on, and the interview had taken its fair share of unexpected turns. But as the show was nearing its end, something in the air had shifted. What started as an uncomfortable conversation had slowly but surely transformed into a more human moment. The host, having learned from his earlier mistakes, had adjusted his approach, allowing Keanu to steer the conversation at his own pace. It wasn't about digging for personal details anymore. It was about listening and respecting the boundaries Keanu had set. Keanu sat back in his chair, his posture relaxed again. He was no longer as guarded as before, but there was a clear sense that he wasn't going to let anyone cross that line again. His answers were still short and to the point, but now they felt more genuine. There was a balance between the man he was on the screen and the person he was behind it, and for once it seemed like the audience could see a little more of the real Keanu. The host, now aware of his own role in the interview, was careful not to push too hard. He had learned that respect was key, and he began asking Keanu questions that felt more like a conversation between two people rather than a star being grilled for information. The audience could feel this shift too. The energy was lighter, and there was a collective sense that they were witnessing something rare, an honest, unfiltered interaction. "So, Keanu," the host said, his tone more relaxed now, "I've got to ask, what keeps you grounded? You've had such a remarkable career, and yet you seem so, well, unaffected by it all. You've never let fame change who you are. How do you do it?" Keanu's smile was small but genuine. It wasn't a question he had been asked many times, but it was one that struck a chord with him. The truth was, he didn't think of fame in the same way most people did. To him, it was just a part of the job, a job that in many ways had given him the freedom to pursue the things that mattered most to him. "Well," Keanu began, his voice thoughtful, "I don't really think about fame all that much. I mean, it's just part of what I do. But it's not who I am. I try not to let it define me." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I think the key is to stay connected to what really matters. The people in your life, the work you care about, the things that make you feel whole. Fame can be a strange thing. People can get lost in it. But I try to stay grounded by focusing on the things that keep me sane. You know, the simple things. The host nodded, clearly intrigued by Keanu's perspective. It sounds like you found a way to balance it all. Not everyone can do that, especially with the kind of success you've had. Keanu shrugged modestly. It's not always easy, but I think it helps to have a solid foundation. I've had my fair share of ups and downs, like anyone else. But I think it's important to remember that life is about more than just the work or the fame. It's about the people you surround yourself with, the values you hold on to. For a moment there was silence. It was a rare thing for a late-night talk show, but in this instance it felt natural. Keanu wasn't just offering sound bites or rehearsed answers. He was sharing a piece of himself, a deeper insight into the man behind the actor. The host, still processing what Keanu had said, leaned in slightly. You've been in this business for decades now, Keanu. Do you ever stop and think about how far you've come? Is there a particular moment that stands out to you as being a turning point in your life or career? Keanu looked down for a moment, as though reflecting on the question. He wasn't one to get nostalgic, but there were certain moments that had shaped who he was, moments that, in hindsight, had defined his path. I think there's a few, he replied, his voice softer now. But if I had to pick one, it would probably be the first time I really felt like I was in control of my own destiny. I had done a lot of films before, but there was a time when I realized that I could take charge of the kinds of roles I wanted to play. That was a huge moment for me. It was when I stopped worrying about the pressures of what others thought and just started doing what I loved. The host smiled, impressed by Keanu's reflection. That's incredible. It's not easy to get to that point, especially in an industry where expectations can weigh so heavily on you. Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's tough. But when you stop worrying about trying to please everyone and just focus on your own path, things start to make more sense. I think that's when I really started to enjoy the work I was doing. It's about finding a balance between the creative side and the business side and learning to trust your instincts. The host looked at Keanu, clearly fascinated. It sounds like you've learned a lot over the years. You know, from the outside looking in, you've always seemed so, well, unaffected. But hearing you talk about it now, it's clear that there's so much more going on beneath the surface. Keanu smiled faintly. There always is, he said. We all have our stories, our struggles, our victories. But at the end of the day, I think it's about staying true to who you are, no matter how much the world changes around you. The host, nodding thoughtfully, added, That's the part people don't always see. They see the movies, the fame, the headlines, but they don't always understand the journey behind it all. It's refreshing to hear you talk about it so openly. Keanu's eyes softened, and for a moment, he seemed to look beyond the cameras, beyond the studio lights, as though he was reflecting on his own journey in real time. I think it's important to remind people that we're all human. We all have our battles, our challenges, and our moments of doubt. But it's also about resilience, about continuing even when things get tough. The host leaned back in his chair, sensing that Keanu had let down some of his walls. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about the man behind the roles. The quiet strength, the introspective nature, the humility that had defined him for years. Keanu, looking slightly more relaxed, shifted the conversation to lighter ground. I'm always interested in hearing about other people's experiences too, he said, smiling. That's one of the reasons I love traveling so much. You meet people from all walks of life, and everyone has a different story to tell. The host grinned, grateful for the change in tone. That's true. The stories are what make life interesting, aren't they? Keanu nodded. Exactly. We're all connected by our stories. That's what I love about movies too. They give us a chance to tell stories that resonate with people. The host, now feeling much more at ease, asked a final question. So what's next for you, Keanu? What are you looking forward to in the future? Keanu thought for a moment, his gaze distant as if imagining the possibilities. I'm always looking for new challenges, new ways to grow. I'm working on a few things, but I never like to talk about them too much until they're ready. But one thing I know for sure is that I want to keep doing what I love, whether that's acting or writing or even just spending time with people who inspire me. I want to keep learning, keep growing. The host smiled, clearly moved by Keanu's words. Well, whatever you do, Keanu, I'm sure it's going to be something special. Keanu's smile was genuine, his eyes warm. Thanks, I appreciate that. As the interview wrapped up, the audience erupted into applause, but this time it was different. The applause wasn't just for the actor on stage. It was for the man who had shown a side of himself that few people got to see. The host, now more comfortable than ever, thanked Keanu for joining him on the show, and the two exchanged a handshake that felt less like a scripted gesture and more like a genuine moment of respect. Keanu stood up, giving a final wave to the audience. As he left the stage, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The interview had given people a glimpse of who he really was. Not just the star on the big screen, but the quiet, thoughtful man who had learned to navigate the complexities of life with humility and grace. The show had ended. The lights were dimming, and Keanu Reeves was back in his dressing room. Despite the applause, despite the hours of interviews and the lights and cameras that had followed him all night, he felt a strange sense of relief. There was no rush to leave, no need to continue putting on the mask of the Hollywood star. He was just Keanu, quietly processing everything that had happened. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the platform or the attention his career had given him. In fact, he had a deep respect for it. But the world of fame, with its constant scrutiny and expectations, was never something he had sought. It had come to him in waves, and over time he had learned how to manage it, how to stay true to himself while navigating through the noise. As he sat alone in the quiet room, the familiar hum of the studio lights buzzing in the distance, Keanu found himself reflecting on the conversation that had just taken place. It had started off uncomfortable, as if the host had been trying too hard to get him to open up about personal matters that he wasn't ready to share. But as the night went on, there had been a subtle shift. The host had learned to respect the boundaries Keanu had set, and in turn, Keanu had let down his guard just enough to share more about himself than he usually did. He thought about the way the host had asked about his career, his philosophy on fame, and the choices he had made in life. Keanu hadn't expected the questions to be so introspective, but in a way they had been a gift. They had allowed him to reflect on his journey, on how far he had come, and how he had arrived at this place in his life. A place where peace was not measured by success, but by staying true to what mattered most. As he leaned back in his chair, Keanu chuckled softly to himself. He remembered the earlier awkwardness when the conversation had steered too close to personal territory. He hadn't liked the direction it had taken, but now in the silence of the dressing room, he realized that it had given him an opportunity to remind both himself and the audience of one important truth. Some parts of life are meant to remain private. Not because they were shameful or to be hidden, but because they were sacred, belonging only to the people who lived them. The door to his dressing room opened, and a staff member peeked in, offering a warm smile. "Keanu, that was a great show tonight." "You did great," she said with a nod. Keanu smiled back, standing up from the chair. "Thanks," he replied softly. "I think it went well." As the staff member turned to leave, she paused for a moment and turned back, as if to say something more. "I just wanted to say, it's really nice to see you like this. So real, you know?" Her words caught him slightly off guard, but in a way, they made sense. He had been real in that interview. He hadn't tried to play a character, hadn't tried to hide behind a polished image. He had just been himself. Keanu nodded, grateful for her kind words. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice sincere. "It's easy to forget sometimes that being real is enough." The staff member smiled and left him alone once again. But her words stayed with him. It wasn't that Keanu didn't enjoy the act of performing. He did. Acting was his craft, his passion, the thing that had given him the freedom to explore different sides of himself. But there was something about being himself, just Keanu, without the layers of Hollywood or the expectations of others, that brought him a different kind of peace. The world could try to define him by his roles, by his public persona, but the truth was the most important parts of his life were ones he kept to himself. He turned to look at his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him was familiar, but not in the way most people saw him. They saw the action star, the quiet, mysterious figure who made audiences swoon with his charm. But this man, the one in the mirror, was different. He was someone who had seen pain, loss, and struggle, someone who had learned to carry those experiences, without letting them define him. Keanu wasn't sure how he had managed to hold on to his sense of self in a world that often demanded more than you were willing to give. But somehow, over the years, he had found a way to navigate it. He wasn't perfect and he didn't have all the answers, but he had learned to keep the things that mattered close to his heart. He reached for his jacket and pulled it on, taking one last look at the dressing room. As he stepped out, the familiar hum of the studio buzzed around him. The energy was different now, quieter, more relaxed, as if the tension of the interview had melted away. People greeted him in passing, offering him nods and smiles, and he returned them with the same quiet warmth. Keanu didn't need grand gestures or applause to feel fulfilled. In fact, he preferred moments like this, small, quiet exchanges where he didn't have to play the role of the famous actor. He could simply be a person among people, sharing the space without any of the weight that fame often carried. As he walked through the backstage area, his mind wandered back to the conversation with the host. The questions about fame, about staying grounded, those weren't things he had thought about in a long time. In a way, the interview had forced him to slow down, to consider the things he had learned along the way. He didn't talk about those things often, but maybe he should. Maybe people needed to hear that there was more to life than just success and fame. There was the quiet work of staying true to yourself, the struggle of dealing with loss and grief, and the simple joys of finding peace in the little things. By the time Keanu stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him like an old friend. He breathed it in deeply, feeling the rush of freshness against his skin. It was a reminder that the world was bigger than any one moment, bigger than any single career. Out here, on the streets away from the spotlight, he could find the kind of peace he craved. He glanced around at the city, the bustling streets that had always been his home. There were people walking by, some with their heads down, others talking to friends, but none of them seemed to notice the man who had just stepped out of the late-night studio. And that was fine with him. He didn't need to be recognized or admired. He was content with who he was, with the life he had built. As Keanu made his way to his car, he thought about the next few days. There were more projects, more filming, more interviews, and the cycle would continue. But for tonight, he allowed himself a rare moment of solitude, of reflection. The world would continue to watch him on the big screen, but behind it all, there was a man who had learned to cherish the quiet, the private moments, the ones where he didn't have to be anyone but himself, and that in the end was all he truly needed.